Huh?
Huh.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Sir Winston Churchill, who is widely remembered in Britain as the man who won the war. As much as this title may be well earned and just, Winston's engagements in politics dates well back to before 1939. Churchill was, in fact, one of the UK's longest serving politicians, becoming an MP in 1900 and only retiring in 1964, just the year before his death. Over the course of these 64 years, Churchill changed his allegiance from the Conservatives to the Liberals in 1904 as a result of the revolutionary set of welfare reforms they promised to introduce, only then to rejoin the Conservatives in 1924, where he stayed until his retirement from politics in 1964. About this move, he famously said, "Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain amount of ingenuity to re-rat." But let's start from the beginning, sparing no detail about the fascinating political life of Sir Winston Churchill. After a military career of fighting in the Second Boer War and in India, Churchill became an MP for the Conservative Party at the turn of the 20th century. However, he only held this post for 4 years before jumping Balfour's old and rusting Conservative ship and hopping aboard Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman's brand spanking new Liberal Party boat, the place to be. In the 1906 election, the Liberal Party won an unexpected landslide victory over the Conservatives. People backed their proposed welfare reforms as poverty was a reality for many people living in Britain at the time. These encouraged a higher level of state intervention and to provide a sort of safety net for the poorest in society. This was seen as a big move from the traditional laissez-faire attitude of the Conservatives. Charles Booth and Sir Winston conducted a survey to find the number of people living below the so-called poverty line in cities, which was established to be around 30%. Of course, Churchill had a part in these reforms. He was responsible for the Trade Board Act of 1909, in which certain trades could set legal minimum wages with the aim of improving the quality of life and treatment for workers. He also set up the labour exchanges to give job seekers a chance to find employment to ensure that the individual could stay out of poverty long enough and provide for their families. He also had a hand in legally setting a maximum 8-hour workday for the miners, who, due to a lack of light and dangerous conditions in the mine, were often overlooked. In 1911, Churchill, together with David Lloyd George, introduced the National Insurance Act, which provided people with a basic level of insurance against both unemployment and health at work. Socially, Mr. Churchill was a supporter of Home Rule for Ireland, which was a very contentious issue at the time and divided the parties, as well as much of the country. Liberals tended to be for Home Rule, whereas Conservatives were more split against Home Rule. Though he was not a committed supporter of the female suffrage movement. As with many men in the early 20th century, he was worried about the impact women may have on the current voting demographic, which would consequently jeopardise their positions in power. There was also no support from within the Liberal Party to include women in elections, with Herbert Asquith, the leader, being a staunch critic of women's suffrage. However, after the war in 1918, Churchill supported the Representation of the People Act, which extended voting rights to all men over 21, as well as female landowners over 30. He, along with many of his colleagues, appreciated the role women had played during the First World War, both in munitions factories, on farms, driving ambulances, as well as wider work to help Britain win the war. Churchill began the war holding the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, which basically meant he was in charge of the Navy. However, when Asquith agreed to an all-party agreement in 1915, the Conservatives insisted that he be demoted from his position before they joined forces. His hand was forced and he was removed from his position at the Admiralty. As a result of this, whilst remaining as an MP, Churchill resigned from the government and joined the army. He spent time serving in the years 1915 and 1916. After Asquith's resignation from the government, Lloyd George became Prime Minister and appointed Churchill as Minister of Munitions. Now, this was met with a lot of Conservative opposition, and Churchill was consequently largely excluded from the rest of the cabinet. However, in this position, he managed to increase munitions production, as well as stop the harmful effect of the strikes along the Clyde. He was also able to continue his work in pushing for the creation of a tank, a weapon that proved to be influential in the war. Despite his traditional Conservative views, post-war Churchill called for some nationalisation of railways, as well as the creation of an international peacekeeping group which later became the League of Nations. However, he did not support the Treaty of Versailles as he viewed the measures too harsh, and he was also strongly anti-Lenin. He was passionately against communism as well as the Bolsheviks in Russia. In 1919, Churchill, in his new role as Secretary of State for War and Air, was tasked with the hefty job of demobilising almost 4 million men from the British Army. He was also responsible for reducing military spending, which, as you can imagine, had pretty much boomed over the past 4 years. With the violence breaking out in Ireland post-war, Churchill supported the government's use of a paramilitary group called the Black and Tans. The idea of this group was to reduce the violence of the IRA, though was largely scrutinised due to their force and heavy-handedness in situations. This was seen widely as a failure of the British government and was condemned by foreign leaders, as well as meeting stark opposition from home. Churchill, along with Lloyd George, was also instrumental in the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. This agreement brought the Irish War of Independence to a close, though it did cause an equally brutal civil war that took over Ireland for the next 2 years. Michael Collins, the member of the Irish delegation who signed the treaty, was shot by anti-treaty groups. There is, in fact, a 1996 even film about Michael Collins starring eye candy Liam Neeson and heartthrob Julia Roberts, if that kind of thing gets you going. Check it out. Anyway, back to Mr. Churchill. In the 1923 general election, Churchill stood as a Liberal candidate, partly due to his dislike of the Labour Party and what MacDonald would do if he came to power. When Ramsay MacDonald eventually became Prime Minister, Churchill took a hard line against their relationship with Communist Russia. Due to Labour failings, including the Zinoviev letter scandal, as well as the Campbell case, there was a general election called for 1924, in which Churchill stood as an independent anti-socialist candidate. Although he did lose to the Conservative representative, the move saw him reabsorbed into the Conservative Party, and he was even made Chancellor of the Exchequer by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Whilst in this position, he hoped to implement his free trade ideologies and minimal market intervention. However, controversially, he did put Britain back on the gold standard in 1925. This did have some dire economic and social consequences, such as unemployment and deflation. Most importantly, however, this resulted in the general strike of 1926. Though it would be unfair to say this was the only factor, it is seen generally as a cause of falling conditions and pay for the miners. This unrest led to trade union representatives calling a general strike in support for the miners. To combat their British Worker magazine, designed to spread leftist propaganda, Churchill began writing and editing the British Gazette, which was essentially a counter-move to the workers' newspaper. Both of these papers shared propagandas, though the Gazette had a much bigger reach and was ultimately more successful. This, paired with other negotiations, helped to solve the unrest in just 8 days, record time. Overall, Winston Churchill played a much larger role in British politics pre-World War II than most people remember. Alongside holding a variety of positions for 2 different political parties and as an independent candidate, he helped to demobilise the troops after the First World War, which, I think we can all admit, would be no easy job. And he also introduced welfare reforms, which worked to improve people's quality of life throughout the country. Though he made some admittedly questionable and even sometimes controversial decisions, such as that to join the gold standard, I think we can all say that his work ethic, paired with a similar determination and a desire to see an improvement in people's lives, was the defining moment of Winston Churchill's political life up to 1926. All that remains left to say is thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like and subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you'd like to see next time. Thanks very much.